Viewer discretion is advised. Chapter 10, Purgatory.
It didn't take long for us to arrive.
Anne recollected the story within her mind. She now found herself in a place of despair, nowhere to turn to. As she remembered the last few days, she only assumed she was still alive. Weak and broken, she continued to grasp onto her fading, distant, and shadowy memories.
I still remember the foul stench. God, it was awful. And the entire bus was filled with those I did not recognize. all our hands bound to the ceiling as we were rocked about by the uneasy earth below. Then I remember crossing that bridge. I remember now. That was where I was able to catch the slightest shred of hope as I peered out the window beyond my seatmate. And there, looking into the distant canal, leading to the vast Pacific ahead, the sun bounced joyfully along its rippled expanse as glimmering sparkles danced across the water's surface. But that didn't last long. We eventually made our way through the last small parts of the town, the abandoned and tattered streets on the other side of the now vanishing bridge. Its defunct buildings we quickly passed, representing a growing feeling of terror from within me. Its pot-marked roads we hastily traveled echoed a chaos that mimicked the thoughts, which were now ricocheting throughout my increasingly darkening mind. We soon arrived at an opening within a tall chain-linked fence, topped with weathered, rusty barbed wires. A tower stood tall inside its borders. As it surveyed the tarmac, it dutifully patrolled night and day. As we rounded the grounds around a tattered structure, appearing to be some kind of airport terminal, or maybe even a hangar, I noticed a flock of birds flutter away off in the distance. For a moment, I swore I saw a dark figure cause the aerial disturbance. But upon further observation, the dark blur evaporated from my view. I felt as if my mind was beginning to turn on me, just as the rest of the world had done. As the chamber-like vehicle slowed, now on the side of this terminal, facing the roads, out of view of the recently passed landing strip, 2 men awaited our arrival. They were standing outside what appeared to be elevator doors. I couldn't help a slight dark humor come over me, the only sanity I had left to cling to. My husband would hate the sight of those elevator doors. He hadn't had much luck with them as of late. But that fleeting sense of humor, though dark as it was, only spurred my racing mind to memories of my husband. Memories that would typically make me smile, but instead only darkened my mind that much more as I thought of Eugene. I knew he was out there somewhere. I was partially inspecting my surroundings, expecting him to show up at any time and rescue me from this terrible position I then found myself in. I could picture his face, clear as ever, standing over our kitchen sink within our long-lost home in the Sonoran Desert. God, I wish we had never left. We would always clean up from dinner together. We never had kids. We were simply too in love with each other for any other distractions. We would playfully flirt and laugh while we cleaned. He would always do the dishes. I hated washing dishes. They always ruined the softness of my hands. He would always interrupt our playing with a smile and tell me how much he loved me, suddenly bringing me out of my quickly slipping acumen. I was being handled by one of the guards who slid my bounds from the dull hook above and unbuckled my waist from the seat, again, and speaking in Russian, a language I was growing to despise. He ordered me up from my seat to escort me off the bus with the others. Stumbling into one another, we were all guided off the vehicle, one by one, and then onto the cracked and chipped overgrown cement below. Once assembled outside, cued by the man escorting us, the 2 men at the elevator doors manually pulled back the sliding walls of its dark descending shaft. A large darkened room with no lights awaited us on the other side, as I failed to fight back the tears coming from my eyes. They ordered us inside as we filed in. Again, one by one, surprisingly forced to be crammed in. As they insisted we all share one trip, there were about a dozen or so. All of us then piled up inside that small, dark room, as no guards joined us for our journey. The aroma was even worse than the ride here, as a sad irony ushered in a longing for that nightmarish sight of the old rusty bus we recently occupied. It was only a small trip down, as we could see the outside of the shaft walls quickly shift up through the opened cracks of the steel doors, now to either side of us, as we traveled lower. The loud sound of a generator echoed from the depths of the structure around us, growing and fading as we descended. Soon the shaft walls, opposite the side we entered, disappeared as the doors slid open and a large room below began to take form. The room was that of a large open warehouse, expanding through the airfields underground, almost as far as you could see. It was dimly lit and had hundreds of old-style, dirty white hospital beds throughout its vast confines. In between the beds were various mismatched metal stools and steel medical tables. On each bed, there were people chained to the frames, at their ankles and wrists, forced to lay completely flat on their backs. They were each completely naked, all of them having tubes coming from their abdomens, leading to medical-like pouches hanging above their beds. That was when I was briefly reminded of Paco's yacht, and the poor souls we had momentarily rescued from below, only later to be put out of their miseries. Within the intimidatingly dim makeshift clinic walked men in hazmat suits, monitoring their suffering prey. One of these men greeted us as we touched ground, this one, however, pointing a rifle at us. He ordered us to move into the sizable chamber as we slovenly poured out of the cramped elevator. The warehouse was purely gray cement. Cement walls, cement floors, and cement ceilings. The ceiling wasn't that high, perhaps 9, maybe 10 feet at the most. The floor was lined with drains at the foot of almost every bed. Our tour guide stopped us over one of these drains and signaled a few others to come assist. This drain, however, was within an opening in the room, where there were no beds. Hanging from the ceiling, though, was a long hose with a large metallic head, and curtains, stained brown and red from dirt and blood, widely circled it. Soon we were inundated by 6 or 7 other men who promptly began undressing all of us. It was terrifying, feeling this way. Just a slave to their diabolical doings. Our clothes were swept up by one of the men, simply using a push broom, gathering a pile of torn and dirty garments in the corner of the room. One of them then reached up to the hose and began spraying all of us. It was scalding hot water. For once, I wasn't the only one screaming, as the entire crowd of newcomers began to feel their flesh boil under the piercing shards of spraying water. It felt like hot, broken glass as it hit our naked flesh, and seemed to last forever, as I swore my skin was being ripped from my bones. We were now all in crouched positions, forced to shield away the watery invasion. That's when I noticed trails of muddy, blood-infused water slowly meandering its way toward the center of our huddle, circling the drain, darkened by our shadows. I then knew why the curtains around us wore this pattern of red and brown, as now my own filth and blood joined them, splattering them in slow motion before my very eyes. I had no more tears to give as I was escorted to what appeared to be nothing less than my final resting place. A bed with a stained and naked mattress with chains dangling to its sides. I didn't want to join the patients that lay around me as I gave one last whimpering cry. As if that provoked my guide, he swiftly forced me onto the bed. Another man cut my bounds off and replaced them with the cold steel shackles. Still dripping from my painful shower, I shivered as the room around me was so very cold. I closed my eyes in terror as I felt my entire body be stretched flat, as my ankles were also chained to the foot of the bed. My eyes now tightly closed, I heard the sound of metal on concrete as I slightly opened one eye and peered over to see the next incoming nightmare. The man who shackled me was gone, and the one who guided me to the bed was dragging a stool to my side and promptly took a seat. He followed that up with sliding a metal table over between him and I, with various tubes and knives laying upon it. The sight of the knives made me grimace as I felt all the blood rush out of my veins. I kept shaking my head, trying to cry out any word in revolt I could possibly muster when another man came up behind him. He was looking at the man on the bed next to me. This patient of theirs seemed completely oblivious to his surroundings. He was plump, pasty, and appeared to be bereft of any semblance of consciousness. The man standing over him gained the attention of my practitioner, and they looked at the man lying on the bed. Then they looked at each other and nodded in agreement. I will never forget what followed. It echoed in my soul and made my blood curdle. The man standing over us pulled to his side what appeared to be some kind of oxygen tank on wheels. It had a hose that came from the head of the tank and led to a tubular object with a trigger on it. He then placed the tubular metal end of the hose flush against the unconscious man's forehead and squeezed its trigger. A small noise came from the tank, like air being blasted out. Then, as the man removed the object from his patient's forehead, blood dripped out from underneath a large metal bolt, now protruding from his lifeless skull. A small and final exhale seeping out from within his lips. I let out a scream, but soon my wailing became muted, robbed of all its sound. I soon had a traumatizing sensation of pain as a knife slid into my belly. I quickly realized I was undergoing an operation. It had become clear to me that I was now going to have one of those dreadful tubes penetrate my abdomen as well. It was also clear no sedation or numbing was going to be taking place. That's all I could remember before the room went dark, and the voices from the closest ones around me became distant and faint. Then I woke up here, chained to my metallic and meager coffin. I don't know when they will slaughter me like my previous neighbor. I don't even care. In fact, I don't feel anything anymore.
Back inside the ghostly terminal, the three looked up at Anne, hanging from the ceiling, plastic wrapped and lifeless, not wanting to think of the horrors she'd endured. We have to get out of here. Somebody's eventually gonna be making their rounds, Seth whispered. Trevor agreed as he held his sister, attempting to console her. Beck interrupted the two. We have to cut her down. We have to bury her. A panicked look swept over Seth's face. We can't do that. We'd be caught for sure. Besides, we have no way of cutting her down. Even if we did, how would we even get up there? Beck's sobbing face immediately became serious as she stood up and looked at Seth. Your friend Eugene wouldn't want her hanging up there. With that, she pushed Seth and Trevor out of the way and grabbed her flashlight from the floor. She took her rifle and aimed it high above Anne's body. She clasped her flashlight next to it, aiming it at the same area. Trevor and Seth looked at each other, horrified with the thought of raising such a sound, possibly alarming anyone nearby. Both in hushed voices, the two tried stopping her. "No, Beck, don't." But without warning, she fired one single shot, sending a hair-raising echo through the frigid chamber. Anne's body came crashing down, her rigid carcass smacking the pavement, making the two of them slightly shudder. "We're not leaving here without her." Beck then turned and walked to the doors. She assumed Trevor and Seth would eventually lift their dropped jaws and clean up their shocked expressions they both were giving her, and proceed to move Anne's body from the terminal. They both looked at each other when Seth questioned Trevor. "How the hell did you survive your childhood?" Trevor rolled his eyes. "Sometimes I really have no idea. Come on, let's get Anne out of here." Later, after the somber night had become dawn, the three of them sat at the edge of a wooded area, a ways from the airfield. They watched the sunrise blanket the eastern district of Esmeralda in a golden morning twilight. For a moment, the discarded town seemed lively as the reflection of the sun peeking over the nearby Ticino jungles gave the distant battered windows of the town a glimmering shine. Before the three sat a shallow grave, a grave for their latest departed companion, Anne. "We should get going. We need to locate another vehicle before ours runs out of fuel," Beck stated to the two. She stood up and swung her rifle over her shoulder and walked back to their truck. Trevor and Seth stood up to follow. They loaded up into their vehicle, and as the engine cranked, soon made their way across the sleepy terrain into the day's distant and dawning lights. The ride had started out with a quiet calm among the three, as a bitter awareness of their many losses shrouded them with a dismal gloom. Seth drove while Trevor sat in the passenger seat, leaving his sister in the back, gazing out the window off into the distance. Trevor had a map in his hands, which Seth had previously discovered in the glove box, and was guiding Seth toward Velta Larga, while they all kept a hopeful eye out for another vehicle to commandeer. "We can't go back over that bridge. It takes us way too close to the Chancellor. We don't need any run-ins with his men. If we stay south on the E15, it shows another bridge that crosses over to Shh! Look! Look!" Beck exclaimed. Trevor looked back to see her pointing out of her window behind Seth. He looked over to what she was excited about and laid his sights on a small truck in the distance. It was on top of a hill, clear of any trees. Seeing the vehicle, Seth pulled to the side of the road and made his way to a small covering of jungle and turned off the engine. The newly spotted vehicle, now in question, became their main focus as they sat in the quiet, dense brush and devised a plan. When Beck had first noticed the vehicle, it was far off into the distant hills, just barely coming into sight. They were all keeping their eyes on it, making sure it did not change position, signaling they'd been made. Seth looked over at Trevor, then back at Beck. "It's gotta have somebody in it. It can't just be up there by itself." Trevor agreed, along with Beck, and quickly formulated a strategy. "I'm sure it's a lookout, and I'm sure they're looking out for the three of us. We walk from here. Take your guns with you. I'll take mine and the backpack of supplies we found in the trunk. We use the forest around it to get a closer look. We find out what we're up against, and then we put Beck's plan into play." "Beck's plan?" Beck said with a mix of confusion. "And what exactly is Beck's plan?" Trevor smiled and looked at his sister. "Whatever is theirs becomes ours. We'll hold the advantage." She let out a small laugh, remembering her strategy to take out Kent and his men. "Music to my ears," she concluded. With that, the three checked their weapons and left their vehicle. They began making their way up a small patch of jungle as they hiked up a slight incline. They made sure to stay clear of the meadows opening alongside their left as they watched their footing within the muddy earth amongst the roots and rocks. They held a muted conversation as they disappeared into the thicket, their voices trailing off, silenced by the dense vegetation. "How much further is it to Vuelta Larga?" Beck questioned, cueing her brother to recite his knowledge of the map, now stowed in his bag. 6, maybe 7 miles, he stated, only to be confronted with another question from his sister. "How big is the town? How do we know where to go when we get there?" "We'll have to wait and see," Trevor answered, spurring a sarcastic remark from Seth. "Seems to be a pattern lately." Meanwhile, back on the clearing on the rise of a small hill sat a small, black military truck. About 200 or so feet from the parked vehicle, the humid jungle prairie met the dense forest of Tachina. Upon a closer view of this wooded entrance, a small disturbance began to take place as the team of 3 began to take form. Trevor took a knee, promptly slipping his backpack down his side and onto the ground in front of him. Beck and Seth both knelt behind him. He then started rifling through the bag and pulled out a pair of binoculars. He put them up to his face and began to study their target. "You gotta be kidding me," he said with a chuckle. Both Beck and Seth immediately questioned the perplexing remark in a whisper. "What is it?" With that, he handed the binoculars to his sister. Beck began peering through them, at first not grasping what her little brother was talking about. But then, oh my God. No way. She handed the binoculars over to Seth. Seth took them up to his face, anticipating, joining his friends in their seemingly gleeful amazement. He peered through them and positioned them right on what they both had just seen. He let out a small laugh, matching Trevor's most recent chuckle. Meanwhile, within the dusty military-grade truck, the 3 were now honed in on. A cartel foot soldier sat in the driver's seat. And this soldier was sleeping. He was a dark Hispanic man, wearing fatigues and sporting a black mustache and beard. And as if it were his passenger, next to him in the upright position in the front passenger seat, sat his rifle while binoculars rested on his chest, hung around his neck. The early morning breeze swept through the car as his overnight shift was slowly coming to an end. And as the breeze swept through, it brought with it a small treat of petrichor, composed from the early morning mist upon the recently dry soil. The aroma began to gently wake the man up as it brought him a slight comfort, ushering in a slow, diminutive smile across his face. Suddenly, his muscles tightened and his face became serious, while his throat underwent the duress of having a knife's serrated edge placed firmly against it. He shifted his eyes and saw a man holding the knife outside his door. Another man smiled while aiming a rifle through his front windshield. And finally, a woman to his right quickly retracted his only weapon within his reach through the front passenger window. Seth, holding the knife, spoke to his friends. "He doesn't look Russian." Trevor, aiming his rifle through the front windshield, lowered it and walked over to Seth. "Nope, looks like cartel." The man in the vehicle tried to speak. "English. I speak English. Take anything you want." "Really, look." The 3 stiffened up and watched the man carefully as he dug into his army vest pocket and pulled out the keys to the vehicle, his hand nervously shaking all the while. He threw them at Seth, landing on the ground. "Take it. You can have it." "Please, yes." Seth looked down at the keys, then back up to the driver and smiled, still holding a knife to his throat. "You are coming with us." With that, the man closed his eyes and sighed as if he knew he wasn't getting out of this. Seth continued as he opened the door. "Move over." Following orders, the man promptly moved over. Trevor and Beck immediately got into the back of the truck, Beck behind Seth, and Trevor behind the soldier. Seth drove the four back to the highway while they proceeded to take advantage of the lack of language barrier in grilling their victim. Seth started off the interrogation. "What's your name?" "Eduardo," the man replied. "Well, Eduardo, what the hell is going on at the airfield?" Beck asked their hostage while Trevor, sitting directly behind him, planted the end of his gun against the back of the man's skull, encouraging him to entertain the line of questioning. Eduardo stammered around within his response. I don't know. I'm not allowed in there. Only feedlot personnel allowed." That's what Kent called it. A feedlot, Seth said as the three of them shared glances. Beck continued her line of questioning. "Why the fuck are they force-feeding people just to kill them?" At that moment, Eduardo looked confused, which gave the three pause as they realized he had no idea what went on inside. "I have no idea. I only see people going in. Just refrigerated trucks coming out," he said, while looking like he himself just realized what was going on. "This is fucked," Seth yelled in the front seat while driving. Trevor sighed in disgust and closed his eyes. Beck added on to Seth's remarks. "They're turning us into fucking meat." They drove in silence for a few minutes before moving on in their investigation. She turned to her little brother, who still had a gun to the back of Eduardo's head. "We gotta get those kids out of there." Trevor looked at her and agreed. Then he looked toward the front and continued their line of questioning. "What about Vuelta Larga? What's up with that place? What happens there?" he said as he shoved the gun harder against Eduardo's head. "All right, okay, muchacho. Like I say, no problem from me, eh? It is same as Esmeralda. Open pasture," he replied. Trevor sighed as Seth added to the discussion. "It's so fucking obvious. Cattle. We're fucking cattle." Then Trevor said something under his breath that drew the attention from the rest of the car. Okrana Skota. Images flashed in his mind of the underground lab. The video that played on the computer that Eugene had hacked. A scientist dictating his journal log entry came into his mind. The scientist continued to speak. "Several days ago, we were finally able to achieve communication with our subject through a variation of mathematical code, letter by letter. The answer was simply Okrana Skota. In English, this translates to cattle guards." A voice played over the scientist in Trevor's head, a voice from a dream he once had. It was a deep, whispering echo of a voice. The voice sounded in his head.
"No, Mr. Meeks. I do not have a name. Simply a title. I am a cattle guard."
This sent Trevor's mind racing. Where had he heard this voice before? How was he hearing it now? But most chilling of all, who or what did this voice belong to? Trevor snapped out of his daze as his sister called his name again. "Trevor, what does that mean?" Okrana Skota. Trevor looked at Seth in the rearview mirror. They both saw into each other's minds as they imagined the puzzle pieces slowly coming together. Seth had remembered the scientist's words as he took it upon himself to answer Beck's question in an almost robotic-like manner. Him and Trevor still locking eyes, recalling the gruesome lab footage. "It's Russian," he stated. "Means cattle guard. Well, what does that have to do with us?" Beck asked in anticipation. Trevor looked down and responded, "I'm not sure, but I think it might have to do with the Russian's client." Another silence swept through the vehicle when Beck finally chimed in. She looked at Eduardo. "You're helping me get my kids back?" Eduardo looked back at her. "From Vuelta Larga? You crazy lady. Santiago runs town. His brother is the chancellor. Very bad idea." Beck gave a sarcastic glance at Eduardo before responding. "We've handled the chancellor. I think we can handle his brother. Eduardo continued his plea. Yes, but Santiago, they call him Muerte. It is a name given to him through generations of his cartel family. It started with his grandfather, Arturo Beltran Leyva, but he has earned this nickname far more than his predecessors. The Chancellor is nothing compared to him. What the hell does Muerte mean? Seth asked, with confusion in his tone. Eduardo looked at him. Then he looked back toward Beck while defining the title for the three. Muerte, in English. In your language, it means death. After this, he hesitated for a moment, then continued warning the three would-be rescuers. Besides, no one goes in and no one come out unless you're working the pasture or being transferred as a prisoner. The place is like a fortress outside the town's borders. Beck and Trevor exchanged glances. Seth joined them in his mirror. He was in on the plan. Then he added his own proposal to the scheme. Let's find a place to rest. We'll enter Santiago's fortress late tonight.